The time period between Pesach and Shavuos for 1,000 years was an extremely joyous time. It was the time of year that we were excitedly and joyously preparing ourselves for re-accepting the Torah. It was a time of springing forward and renewal and optimism and fusing the renewed spiritual energy we got from Pesach with the upcoming Torah we were going to get on Shavuos. In fact, the Sfas Emes, amongst others, says that the reason why the counting of the Omer is found in the Torah in the middle of the Parsha of the Mayadim is because Firas Omer is really one big giant Chol HaMoed between Pesach and Shavuos. And like Chol HaMoed, it should be filled with happiness and joy and song, and yet, nowadays, it's not. It's a time of mourning. We don't listen to music. We don't shave. We're filled with sadness. We are mourning because 1,800 years ago, 24,000 of Reb Akiva's Talmidim died, and we haven't forgotten till today. Now let's ask some pretty obvious questions. There have been many horrible, almost unthinkable things that have happened to the Jewish people throughout our history, and yet they don't get even more than one day of mourning. There was the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the breaking of the Luchos after the Chet HaEgel. There was the Spanish Inquisition, which had far more deaths than the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva did, as did the Crusades, as did Chmielnicki massacres, as did the Holocaust. In the year 1298 in Franconia and Bavaria, places we've never even heard of, there were 100,000 Jews killed. In 1915, the Russian army killed 100,000 Jews. In 1917, Ukrainians killed 200,000 Jews. In 1918 and 1919, 120,000 Jews were killed in close to 500 pogroms. Yet we don't even give these tragedies their own day. We just lump them together with Tisha B'Av, and many of us don't even know that they happened. So why do the deaths of Reb Akiva's Talmidim not only get their own day, but they get 33 days, and not any 33 days, but 33 days, which are Chol HaMoed days, which are festive days, which we would have otherwise been celebrating with happiness and joy? Why don't we mourn for the Talmidim of Reb Akiva on Tisha B'Av like we do every other one of the hundreds of our horrible things that happened to the Jewish people? And another glaring, obvious question to any thinking person needs to ask is, what exactly are we celebrating on Lag BaOmer? What, that the Talmidim stopped dying? The only reason the Talmidim of Reb Akiva stopped dying was because there was no one left to die. We shouldn't celebrate that day. We should turn that day into a very sad day of remembrance for those that died. So why are we celebrating? So the only way to properly understand the power and significance and meaning of Lag BaOmer is to understand the history surrounding the Talmidim of Reb Akiva. In the year 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, and the Jewish people were decimated. Thousands were killed, and thousands more died in starvation. Yerushalayim was a wasteland. Thousands were sold into slavery. We ran for our lives. So crushing was the blow to the Jewish people as a whole, both physically and in morale, that Titus erected his now famous victory arch in Rome, which on it he proudly wrote, Judea capita, or in English, Judaism is kaput. The Jews are finished, and at least he thought so. He thought the annoying Jews, who were one of the only groups on earth that refused to give in to the Roman society, the only group that refused to be subsumed, much like almost the entirety of the civilized world at the time was subsumed. He thought those Jews who were now running literally for their lives would be gone forever, crushed, and subsequently absorbed by the countries they fled to and vanished into the pages of history. And he proudly thought to himself that although many have tried before him, it was I, Titus, who succeeded in finally ridding the world of its Jews, and quite honestly, he was pretty close to being right. Far too close to being right. But he was wrong. He was dead wrong. Because the Jews never give up, the Jews never give in. They slowly but surely kept on building back. A shul here, a Sefer Torah there, a mikveh here, a bris milah there, and before long in the year 135 CE, a man named Bar Kokhba came along, and he aroused and he aspired Yidden wherever he went. He organized an army that was determined to rid the land of the Romans and to recommit to living a life of Torah and Avodah and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash once and for all. And at first he got tens of followers, then he got hundreds of followers, then thousands and tens of thousands of followers who were so inspired and encouraged to keep holding up the torch of Ruchnius and Torah, that they galvanized themselves to take on the notorious Roman army, arguably the most effective and strongest army in world history. Bar Kokhba was so inspired that even Reb Akiva, the greatest sage at the time, rallied behind him. He encouraged Bar Kokhba, and he was deeply impressed and captivated by the dedication of him and his soldiers. And although the Talmidim of Reb Akiva were hesitant, this was going to lead to a bloodshed. They said this would ultimately lose. Reb Akiva assured them that if they kept on learning and davening, if they kept on holding up the torch of Torah, Klal Yisrael would succeed. Bar Kokhba was so passionate to rid the land of the Romans and rebuild Eretz Yisrael that he accumulated an army of 200,000 people. And these people weren't just going along for the ride. The Gemara in Yerushalmi, Tainis Perek Dalid Daf Hey, says that to physically take part in Bar Kokhba's army, Bar Kokhba required, he demanded that each soldier cut off a finger to prove that he really believed in the cause. And eventually he switched the test to requiring each soldier to uproot a young tree with one hand while riding on a horse. Now, there were people who disagreed with Reb Akiva's stance with Bar Kokhba. But Reb Akiva pointed to the crumbling Roman society in which hundreds of thousands of Romans were moving off of Roman paganism and finding alternative lifestyles. Thousands converted to Yiddishkeit, and many more thousands proudly joined forces with Bar Kokhba to rid the land of the evil Romans. There were even members of the Roman Senate that converted to Judaism. Schools open, shuls open, Torah was being learned from north to the south, and Reb Akiva believed that if his Talmidim would learn and daven and inspire the Yidden, spread out all throughout the empire to stay strong and to join in with Bar Kokhba, Hashem would ensure that they would be successful. And Reb Akiva knew that if the revolt were in fact successful, Yidden from all over the world would return, and a great tshuva would occur, and the third Beis HaMikdash could be rebuilt, and the Yidden would live in peace. The Rambam in Hilchos Malachim Parach Yud Aleph Halacha Gimel says that Reb Akiva believed so deeply in Bar Kokhba and the spiritual mission he was on that he publicly made known that Bar Kokhba was Mashiach. The Gemara says that Reb Akiva switched Bar Kokhba's name from Bar Kosiva to Bar Kokhba, alluding to the pasuk of Bamidbar Chav Daled Yud Zayin, which says, Darach Kaychav me Yaakov, a star will rise up from Yaakov. And Reb Akiva, believing that Bar Kokhba was that star, proclaimed him to be the long-awaited Mashiach, and he would lead the army, while Reb Akiva and his 24,000 Talmidim would be the sort of spiritual ammunition fueling the war that Reb Akiva knew would bring the ultimate redemption. And quite frankly, at the beginning, everything seemed to be on trajectory towards Mashiach. Bar Kokhba and his army managed to unite and inspire the Jews scattered around the Roman Empire. Hundreds of thousands of Yidden were doing Shuvah. Tens of thousands of non-Jews were rallying behind the Jewish cause. The time was certainly ripe to usher in Mashiach, and initially Bar Kokhba's army was massively successful. Many non-Jews who saw the light joined in with Bar Kokhba's army and brought the total number of soldiers in his army to 350,000, which at the time was even larger than the Roman army. Bar Kokhba was so successful that Hadrian was forced to call in his best troops, who were in England and Gaul at the time, and even those troops failed. The Jewish army was unstoppable. The two Roman legions in Eretz Yisrael at the time, there was one in Yerushalayim and there was one in Megiddo, were both decimated by Bar Kokhba. And even the reinforcements that came in from Transjordan and Syria and Egypt destroyed. Bar Kokhba and his army had so much momentum and strength that Hadrian had to send in his best commander, Julius Severus, who at the time was in battle in the hills of Wales. And Severus was told to import legions from Britain and Switzerland and Austria and Hungary and Bulgaria, yet Bar Kokhba just kept on winning. Victory after victory, Bar Kokhba seemed to be on his way to bringing the final Mashiach that the Jewish people desperately needed. The pain of the two Batei Mikdashes, the two Beis HaMikdashes that were destroyed, seemed to be at its end. The final light seemed to be arriving, but it didn't. Suddenly the victory stopped. Something happened. the spiritual energy protecting Bar Kokhba and his army suddenly left, and machlaikas began to break out. Betrayal, suspicion, murder took place within the army, and the soldiers were left in utter confusion. What happened? What was going on? What changed? Well, now the Gemara's famous words carry a lot more weight. 24,000 Talmidim of Reb Akiva died. Of course it's sad when people die. Of course there have been many people who died throughout history, but these weren't any old people. These Talmidim were the ones supporting the army. These Talmidim were the spiritual ammunition to Bar Kokhba's miraculous war. These Talmidim were supposed to galvanize the Jews of the world and usher in Mashiach that was inches away of coming in. Yet they died. They were killed in a plague sent from heaven. Why? How? How could such a tragedy happen? What could they possibly have done at one of the most auspicious times in all of Jewish history to have stopped Mashiach from coming? Because they weren't mechabed one another. Because they didn't respect one another. Because their interpersonal relationships were flawed. And because of their lack of respect for one another, Hashem determined that they no longer were fit to be the spiritual protectors of Klal Yisrael. And their deaths brought about the end of the spiritual fuel to Bar Kokhba's army. And with Bar Kokhba's army missing its spiritual ammunition, the single greatest tragedy in Jewish history other than Tisha B'Av took place. And that is what happened in the city of Betar. Betar was the fortress in which Bar Kokhba and his army were stationed. Betar was the epicenter of the Jewish Tshuva movement, a city that the Gemara says at the time had 500 Jewish schools in it, and the smallest of those schools had 500 kids in it. And Bar Kokhba was sure that this would be the last battle and the knockout punch that would crush the Romans once and for all, but it wasn't. The Yidden didn't just lose the battle. They were incinerated. They were dismantled. They were decimated in ways almost too gruesome to mention. 580,000 Jews died. 580,000 Jews. The Gemara in Taina says there was so much blood coming out of the city of Betar that despite being 40 mil from the ocean, it managed to flow into the ocean and colored the ocean red for 4 mil into the ocean. We were butchered, we were slaughtered, we were burnt to a crisp, and the survivors were all enslaved, never to be heard from again. Bar Kokhba was killed and his army was dismantled and crushed, but more importantly, not only did Bar Kokhba die, but the dream of Mashiach died with him. As Rav Pinchas Stopler writes, Bar Kokhba wasn't a false Mashiach. He was a failed Mashiach, an unsuccessful Mashiach. The death of Reb Akiva's Talmidim brought the death of our hopes, of our dreams, of our messianic aspirations. It extended the gullus thousands of years, and it's not because they didn't learn enough, and it's not because they didn't daven enough, but because Shaloi Nagu Kavod Zeh B'Zeh. We were inches from the finish line, perhaps closer to Mashiach than we've ever been, and it was all stopped because Shaloi Nagu Kavod Zeh B'Zeh. It was stopped, and we were forced to endure thousands of years of exile, of running for our lives, of murder, of inquisitions, of pogroms, of libels, of ghettos, of suicide bombers, of car rammings, of dose after dose after dose of Zyklon B, all because Shaloi Nagu Kavod Zeh B'Zeh. We weren't merely mourning the deaths of 24,000 Talmidim. We were mourning the death of Mashiach, the death of our hopes to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, the death of the utopian world we could have had. If you think about the level of despair after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, if you think that was bad, the Jews at the time of the defeat of Bar Kokhba were crushed. They were broken. Where do we go? What do we do? It was all over. Hadrian had a vineyard that was 18 mil by 18 mil, and he took the corpses from Betar and he tied their outstretched hands to form a fence surrounding his vineyard. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish corpses strung together for miles, and the surviving Jews could do nothing but just look at them. We were crushed. Our spirit was crushed, but not only broken, but it was broken and spat on and trampled on and then buried alive. The Jewish people should have been finished. Jewish history should have been over with. But it wasn't. Because there was one man still alive. There was one man who didn't die. There was one man who saw it all and knew the secret to moving on, and that man was Reb Akiva. And he would never give up. rip off his skin, burn him alive, it made no difference. He would hold the torch of Yiddishkeit for all to see no matter what you do to him, and he knew the secret. He stood up and he screamed it loud and he screamed it proud. This is the only way forward. This is the only way we can ever bring Mashiach back. So he got right back to work, and a man accustomed to leading 24,000 students began again from scratch, and he taught 5 students the legacy of Torah, and one of those 5 was a man named Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who wanted more than the raw Torah in its outer sort of superficial casing. He wanted the panimi, he wanted the inner meaning, the inner spark, because he came to the realization that it's time for Klal Yisrael to learn how to internalize the Torah and to inject it into such a deep part of its neshama that it affects your every soul. It makes you an ish kaddish, an ish tahar, a yid on fire, who is filled with nothing but kavod zelazeh. And Hashem took notice of his remarkable dedication to the panemius of Torah. And therefore Hashem revealed to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai on Lag BaOmer what is now referred to as the Zohar, the mystical underworkings of Judaism and Torah, with the hopes that he would infuse more people with Torah depth and make them wholesome and make them pure and harmonious, people who can carry on the torch of Hashem down the twisted road of history. And this Torah that Reb Shimon got, he began to teach one person at a time, and he breathed new hope into the Jewish people that although we were crushed and Mashiach didn't come, but we don't despair and we don't give up. And therefore on Lag BaOmer we dance and we sing and we scream with all our might to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the man who taught us to never give up and to never despair and to let the Torah seep into our souls and make us the most loving group of people on earth, because that's the only way we're going to have another shot at Mashiach. Sinas chinam and shalei nagu kavod zelazeh is what sent Mashiach away. Ahavas chinam and kavod zelazeh is what's going to bring it back. Every single month, for thousands of years, Jews go outside in the dark of the night and say Kiddush Levana. We look up at the moon and we hope that this will be the month. We hope that this will be the time when Mashiach will finally come and our tsaros will go away and Hashem's name will finally get the glory it rightfully deserves. And right at the end of Kiddush Levana, we say a little tefillah for Mashiach to arrive. We say, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim. We declare that Mashiach ben David is on his way. This should be the month when he finally arrives. And what do we say immediately after we daven for Mashiach? What do we say immediately after we daven for Mashiach's arrival? We turn to our friend, we turn to our neighbor, we turn to our shulmate, and we say, Shalom Aleichem Aleichem Shalom, Shalom Aleichem Aleichem Shalom, Shalom Aleichem Aleichem Shalom, because that's the only way. Because the only way we're going to have another shot at Mashiach is Shalom Aleichem Aleichem Shalom. Shalom Nagu Kavod Zelazeh is what sent it away. Kavod Zelazeh is what's going to bring it back. Because how ridiculous it would be to ask for Mashiach while we're still entrenched in Machlekes, entrenched in Lashon Hara and Sinna. The only way to bring Mashiach is Kavod Zelazeh, is Shalom Aleichem Aleichem Shalom. And when we turn back to our siddur, we whisper under our breath, Simin Tov U'Mazel Tov, for Mashiach is coming, and we can feel it. And we say, Yehei Lanu U'Lechol Yisrael, every single person in Klal Yisrael, every boy, every girl, every mother, every father, every Chassid, every Litvak, every Svardi, every Ashkenazi, every Jewish backpacker in India, every Jewish soul from the 4 corners of the globe, Yehei Lanu U'Lechol Yisrael, Amen, V'Amen.